Oh, gotcha. Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode, an exciting episode, apparently, of Lunch with PB&J. That's Jay. Joy in the hizzy.
In the house.
Joy in the house. Who's in the house? Remember that song?
Mm-hmm. JC.
Who's in the house? It's an old, back when dance music was the thing, and there was all these Christian dance groups. That was worldwide message tribe right there. Jumping in the house of God, jump up, jump up. All right, so we're talking about parables today. We're continuing our series on parables, and it's like our camera is tilted. Oh, it's kind of... You're just going to have to forget that. It's going to drive me crazy, probably going to drive some of you crazy, but it's too late now. We're already into this thing. But we are talking about parables. Mm-hmm. Last week we talked about the parable of the sowers. Mm-hmm. This week we are taking on a new parable, which is actually almost like three parables in one, all discussing the same point. So he discussed fasting, clothes, and wine. Mm-hmm. Fasting and feasting.
You probably know it from the illustration of the wineskins.
Have you been singing the song today?
No.
You haven't?
No.
Really?
Have you?
I've been singing today.
New wine? Well, he always sings about everything.
But I thought, okay, I'm surprised. You haven't been singing at all?
No.
What song am I singing?
New wine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where there is new
Look it up,
wine,
it's good.
there is new power. All right. So, Luke chapter 5. This is a parable that is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we're going to read from Luke because it gave just I think it had one extra verse.
Yeah.
Had one extra verse, gave just a little bit more. So here's what I'm thinking, Joy. Kind of got to sneeze. Here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to read it, and then we're going to go back.
Sounds good.
And break it down.
Gotcha.
How's that sound?
Yep.
Because, it's going to be kind of hard to break up, to go as we go, read it as we go. So I'm just going to read it.
Did you tell him what
it's
it
just
was?
a few verses. Luke chapter 5, verses 33 to 39, and it says this. One day some people said to Jesus, John the Baptist's disciples fast and pray regularly, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. Why are your disciples always eating and drinking? Jesus responded, do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. But someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Then Jesus gave them this illustration. No one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and uses it to patch an old garment. For then the new garment would be ruined, and the new patch wouldn't even match the old garment. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the new wine would burst the wineskins, spilling the wine and ruining the skins. New wine must be stored in new wineskins, but no one who drinks the old wine seems to want the new wine. The old is just fine, they say. So, we're going to break it down a little bit. So people came. So basically, here's the idea. I don't know if it's an accusation or a question. What do you think?
I kind of just felt like it was a question.
Right? I feel like it's just a question.
Because it just says some people.
We could jump on them. We could try to throw them under the bus and say, these people are accusing people of everything.
I think it was an observation.
It felt like an observation, and people are trying to understand what's going on. So here's the question, all right, that's posed to Jesus. Is they come to him and they say, listen, all these other disciples, and in that day, a disciple, when we think of disciples, we think of Jesus and the 12 disciples. Right. So we automatically think that followers of Jesus, but a disciple was just a student. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of teachers of any kind, they all had disciples because they all had students. Mm-hmm. And so you could be, just before the time of Jesus was the time of Aeropostale. I do it. I do it every time.
I don't know that guy.
Aristotle.
I think Aeropostale is a store.
It's the clothing. Yeah. I always do that.
Okay, he's got to name it something funny because of that.
Aristotle. and
Socrates
and Plato, and they all had disciples. These were all philosophers. They all had disciples. So here they're coming and they're saying, listen, the disciples of John, so guys that were following John the Baptist around, and the Pharisees, students of the Pharisees were teachers of the religious law, of the Jewish law and stuff. They said their disciples are always fasting. And then we noticed that yours are always eating and drinking, which is why I'm a follower of Jesus. No, and so they said, why? What's the difference? Why is that happening? So now I'm not sure. I read through it real quick in each of the Gospels. I'm not sure if this was necessarily around a specific time of fasting. I didn't see anything.
My commentary just mentioned that it was like regular fasting was something they did like 2 to 3 times a week. So it was just the fact of regular fasting.
So yeah, under the Jewish traditions and things like that in the Jewish religion, fasting was very, very common. And so they were just making the observance of, these guys, these other disciples of these other religious leaders and teachers, they're always fasting, but yours are never fasting. What's the deal with that? So I don't think it was. I don't think it was around a specific time of year because a lot of the feasts and tradition, ceremonies and celebrations and things like that, they would have a feast, but then there was also times of fasting that would take place that called for fasting as well. So I don't think it was anything specific that was going on. So then you just look at, well, what is fasting? What is it for? Why does it exist? If you don't know, if that's kind of a new term to you. Sorry, I had something in my throat.
He's in a weird mood.
I'm not. I'm tired and hungry is actually what it is. Abstaining. So a fast is abstaining from food for a period of time for a spiritual purpose.
Right.
Obviously, today, of the diet fad, intermittent fasting, where you don't eat for a certain period of time. But that's not what this is. Fasting, I always say fasting without prayer is just starving yourself. It's a diet, right? So when it talks about fasting in the Bible, especially under Jewish law and traditions and things like that, when Jesus talked about it, because it was something Jesus talked about, it has a spiritual purpose. And, part of it goes back to the Levitical law. One of the times was during the Day of Atonement. So that was the day that people would come and kind of offer sacrifices for their sin. Fasting was a part of that day. There were special times of fasting called for. It was used as a time of humbling yourself before God.
And being closer to God.
To be closer to God, to seek direction. Think about it. In some familiar Old Testament stories, in Esther, for example, they know that the king is about to pass a decree that would put all the Jews at risk of being destroyed. And so she calls for the nation of Israel to go on a 3-day fast with her before she goes and speaks to the king. Daniel is praying for an answer from God, and he prays and fasts for 21 days. It's where we get the Daniel fast from. So there's fasting that's talked about for all different types and reasons, but it really is for spiritual purpose, to draw closer to God, to hear from God, to learn from God, to seek God, and all these different reasons. In the New Testament, if you go to the New Testament, the earliest time that fasting is mentioned in the New Testament is actually right when Jesus is born.
Okay.
So it talks about two very little known prophets, Anna and Simeon. You don't know Anna and Simeon? All right. I thought you've talked about them before. No. That's why I thought I was setting you up to.
No.
All right. So it's this very small reference right after Jesus is born. There's two prophets. One of them is Anna. It's one of the only female prophets you hear about in the Bible. But Anna is there, and it says that she lived out her days in the temple praying and fasting. And so they come and they speak a blessing over Jesus.
Cool.
Yeah. And find that in Luke. All right. So that's the earliest. But then we see as you go forward in Jesus' life, obviously the 40 days in the wilderness, Jesus fasted when the devil came and tempted him. He encouraged fasting in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, when you give, when you pray, and when you fast. Those were all things that showed the expectation that Jesus, he expected us to continue in these practices. And so if that's the case, if something that he taught on, something that he expected, why didn't his disciples do it? So that's kind of the question that we're going to answer here. It's a very valid question. If nothing else, it's a very valid question. It's something that he makes clear should be an ongoing practice, but not while he's here. And that's kind of the answer that he gives.
Yeah.
And so throughout his ministry, Jesus compared his relationship with us to that of a marriage. So here we see it again. I'm going to read the verses again as we go through. We'll break it into 3 sections. So in verse 34 and 35, it says, Jesus responded to the question, do wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Of course not. But someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they'll fast.
Yeah. I read that and I thought, like, how silly it would be to go to a wedding. You know, he puts it in this example, but how silly it really would be to go to a wedding, especially one of these Italian weddings where they have all these courses come out one after the other, and the antipasta bar and this bar
the porchetta comes out,
all this stuff, and to be like, no, thank you, I'm fasting. You know,
what a terrible time to pick to fast.
Yeah, and I'm sure the groom and bride would be like, that's rude.
Well, and also you're not participating in the celebration.
Yeah.
That's why it's so wrong. I mean, he's literally like going, that would be ridiculous.
Yeah.
It would be wrong. Like like you say, what a slap in the face to the groom to not celebrate this joyous occasion.
Right.
And so Jesus is saying here, he uses this analogy of the fact that wedding guests don't fast while they're celebrating because it's a time of celebration. It's feasting, not fasting. It's a time of feasting, not fasting.
And he shows that there's an appropriate time to do it. He's just saying right now is not the appropriate time to do it.
Right. And so he explains and the meaning behind it, because he doesn't go obviously deep into the explanation, but we can kind of read into what Jesus is saying here and give the explanation, which is the disciples didn't need to fast while they were with Jesus because they were with Jesus.
Yeah.
And we just said, like, what was the point of fasting in the Old Testament? What was the point of fasting? Why did John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples, why did they continue in the practice of fasting? It was to be closer to God. It was to seek God. Well, who was Jesus?
Yeah, yeah.
He was God.
So I find that really cool, because even that line where he talks about, do the wedding guests fast while celebrating with the groom? Like, I don't know if people catch, who he's calling himself, And so it's just this thing. All this shows who he is proclaiming to be. If they're catching that then they'll see that.
So everything that they were fasting for, all the reasons that you fasted for, that was being fulfilled in the moment while they were with Jesus.
Right.
It was a time of celebration because he was there. What they had been fasting for was to be with God. And here God was in the flesh, in Jesus, to be in communion, to get to have his wisdom and his teaching and his guidance and his leading and all those things. It was right there with them. So that season of ministry, that 3.5 years of ministry that the disciples were with Jesus, it was truly a time of feasting, not fasting.
Yeah.
It was a time for them to take in and consume as much of Jesus as they possibly could.
Right.
Because he was there and he was with them. But then he says in verse 35, however, someday the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. In other words, for a season, they didn't need to do it because he was with them. But there's coming a time where the groom would be taken, and then they would need to fast again. So he's saying, my disciples aren't fasting now because I'm with them. But in a minute, I'm going to be taken away, and then they'll return back to fasting
flip a few
again.
chapters ahead, and it happens, in the sense of, like, they go into just pure hysteria because he is taken away. And it's just this thing of then they're crying out to God, and they need to fast then. They need to pray. They need to do those things because he's not right there with them. So I like that statement too, because it's prophetic. Even that statement, is prophetic.
So then what happens next in those next few verses that come afterwards is Jesus then rolls into the parable. I feel like the groom and the feasting is more of an analogy.
Yeah.
I don't really know what the difference is between analogies and metaphors.
But what I saw
but
is,
I think it's more of an analogy.
What I saw is this thing is like it brought up this parable out of a question.
Yeah.
But you know how Jesus always has this ability to where somebody will ask a question, but then he gets to the deeper meaning of it.
Yeah.
And I feel like, the question was, why don't your disciples fast? And to me, you also could say, why do you look different? Mm-hmm. Why are you different?
Yeah.
Why don't you fit this mold that we have of what we think you should be doing? And as much as maybe they're not like accusing him or anything, they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But it's still that question of why do you not fit the mold, which to me kind of...
Well, and I think that's why his answer is a little softer than some of the answers that you see him give sometimes, is because I don't feel like it was an accusation against his disciples. I feel like it, like you're saying, people noticed there was a difference.
Yeah.
So what is that difference? Why are they doing it? So Jesus then takes this opportunity to kind of shift a little. So he gives the answer of, hey, they're not fasting because they're with me. I mean, that's basically what his answer is. There will come a time where I won't be here. They'll go back to fasting again. But he then uses it as an opportunity to shift into this parable to explain that there is something new that's happening. And the reason they're asking this question is because, hey, your disciples aren't doing what we've always done.
Yeah.
They're not following the old traditional ways. They're not following what we've always been taught to do. Why not? And so Jesus then takes the parable, and there's going to be two parables here, about one about clothes and one about wine, and he's going to use this this interaction to kind of give this understanding that the understanding of God really is changing.
Right.
How God interacts with us is changing. And so we're going to see that in these next two, in these parables that follow. He was changing the understanding of God, not to mention just even how we're forgiven and how the payment of sin, like all of these things, like everything, we're coming out of the old covenant and into the new covenant. And so it's just a shift. And so the Old Testament law had always held this covenant between God and his people.
Yeah.
There were certain things that needed to be done to be in favor with God, and life and the life and death of Jesus would be the shift in all of that. And so this was really the beginning of a new era.
And I think we have to kind of, you mentioned it one time when you were preaching of every time I read the Bible, I have to kind of put myself in that scenario to really get the full grasp of what's said. And I think you have to do that because you have to understand Jesus hasn't died yet.
Right.
This is not later in Acts where so many things have been explained. He's there to show them. And again, it's a short amount of time. It was, 3.5 years of his teaching.
And this is fairly early in his ministry.
Right.
So he's fairly early into his ministry. And so, he's not said a lot of super controversial stuff yet. So this really is kind of an introduction to there's a new thing happening.
Yeah.
There's a new wind. The winds of change, they are a-blowing. All right. So then verse 36, he begins the parable. Or illustration, as it says here. Then Jesus gave them this illustration: no one tears a piece of cloth from a new garment and uses it to patch an old garment. For then the new garment would be ruined, and the new patch wouldn't even match the old garment. So, think of it in practical terms. Those are the things with the parables of Jesus.
Yeah, they're just practical.
They're super practical. Yeah. You get lost when you try to find the deep spiritual meaning, but when you think of it in really practical terms, it helps you to understand the deep spiritual side of it. And so here is just this idea of, if I buy a brand new shirt, if I go to the store and I buy a brand new shirt and I bring it home, and my favorite t-shirt that I've had since I was in high school, that's 30 years old and I would wear it all the time, and it's just a memento, but it's thin. It's that one that's like super thin. You can see right through it, but it's so comfy. And it's like I go and buy a brand new t-shirt and my old favorite shirt has a hole in it. And so I cut a little piece off of the new t-shirt and I sew it onto the old one. Like, who does that? Why would I ruin something that's brand new and perfectly good? So now I've ruined the brand new one.
Yeah.
I've sewn it onto the old one where the whole thing is see-through. even if it's the same color, it doesn't match. You can see that it's like, oh, those two things don't go together.
Well, and let's get this visual. One is worn out.
Yeah.
And one is brand new.
And one is already stretched out.
Yeah.
Like, that's the other thing is, when you get something that's new, you got to work it in, right? Imagine some jeans or something like that. You get a pair of jeans, you got to wear them a few times to really get them stretched out and worn in, or maybe a shirt where you wash it a couple times and it's going to shrink a little bit. Well, then you put new material on there and try to wash it. As soon as it gets wet and dries out, it's going to stretch in a different way, and it's just going to pull the seams out, and it's going to tear.
Yeah.
And now you've ruined two perfectly good shirts, right? So from a practical standpoint, you don't do it.
Right.
It just doesn't even make any sense to do it. And that's what Jesus is saying is there's a new thing. There's a new thing that's happening, and you don't want to, as much as lost my train of thought there for a second. So Jesus was ushering in this new freedom.
Well, I think that's the important part to understand. The illustration is simple, but the part of my questions as I'm reading is, okay, what do the garments represent? What does the garments represent?
What do you think they represent?
I feel like the garments represent the covenant, the new covenant.
Yeah.
So you have in the Old Testament, have the old covenant, and again, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was the laws that the Mosaic laws and all that. And you have the old covenant where they would have to go and sacrifice an animal, and that would be the payment for their sin. But then you have the new covenant, and that's what Jesus is basically teaching and living out. And then he fulfills that when he goes and dies on the cross. So it's the old covenant and the new covenant. And that's what he's saying to me, the garment. That would be the illustration of the garment, is that covenant. It's two different covenants. There's an old one. Yeah. He's not saying there's anything bad about the old one, but he's saying there's a new covenant.
But it had holes.
But he had, yes. And you couldn't
flawed.
Match them. They were not, how would you word that? You couldn't how would you word that? You
it's like, it's like old technology and new technology almost, right?
Yeah.
Like there gets to be a certain point in technology where it doesn't apply to the old anymore. Like you can't use new software on old equipment. You can't do it.
My commentary, I wrote it down. It was really good, I thought. It says, Jesus did not come to patch up or fix the old covenant, but to establish a new one. Yeah. Because like Ben's saying, there was holes in the old covenant. Like it was worn out. It was stretched out. It was old. And so it's not the thing that, in its time, that's what God provided. But it was old, worn out. And so it was this thing of Jesus didn't come to patch up the old one. It's this image of he came to bring something brand new. And
so it's this, but and in that, you think of the words of Jesus where he said, I didn't come to abolish the law. Right. I didn't come to do away with the old garment. We're not going to burn it. Right. We're not going to torch it. All right. I didn't come to abolish the law, but I came to fulfill it. Yeah. I came to do what it was actually meant to do. Yeah. The old one didn't work. And the reason for it is because it was law, it was rules, it was you have to obey these things, and nobody could live up to it. And so there was this constant having to come in and patch it and patch it and patch it and patch it. But Jesus didn't. He said, I didn't come to fit into the old way of doing things. I came to do something new.
And there's a finality in that. Is the great part about it.
And so with that, it has to be a new thing. Jesus offered something new. Life was in him and him alone. This is what Jesus was going to start teaching from here on out, is life is in me. If you want new life, Jesus never offered to fix the old life. He offered you new life. This is vital, I think, for us, is we sell it on, we sometimes sell people on Jesus is going to fix your old life. Jesus isn't interested in fixing your old life. He's not a patch. He's something new. He's a new garment, right? Like, could you imagine meeting somebody and their clothes are just filled with holes? And so you could go, hey, you know what? Give me all your clothes and I'm going to put patches on all your clothes. Or you could say, you know what? Here's a brand new set of clothes.
I used to do that back in the day. We would put patches on our jeans.
Yeah.
I got a visual.
Yeah. And so Jesus, that's what he's trying to establish here is he's not a patch to be added to the old way.
Yeah.
All right. It's not, and this is why, and I've talked about this before. It's not, salvation is not Jesus and it's Jesus alone, right? Salvation is, and so this is what happens, excuse me, is that under the old system, it was all about laws, and that's what people were used to, is I've got to perform, I've got to live up, I've got to do certain things, I've got to fast. Yeah. I've got to fast. This is how I stay close to God, as I humble myself and I fast and I pray and I do all of these things. And Jesus is like, those things are good, but there's going to be something new that's coming. There's something new that's here. And so it's not about adding Jesus to the old traditions. That's not what it was. Jesus said, it's not about adding me to the old way of doing things. I'm a new way of doing things.
And can I just say, I don't know, maybe some people would argue with this statement, but I just feel like, if we look at it, new is better. I know we can reminisce and we can think about this or that, but new is better. You get a new phone, it's better. You get a new house, it's better. You get a new car, it's better. New is better for a reason.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And it goes back to that mentality, or the thought of just the one had its place and we might have fond memories of it, but it's worn out.
Yeah. And I want to talk about the wineskin for a second, and then we'll come back to this because it all kind of says the same thing. So, but I feel like I'm gonna jump over myself if I don't go ahead and read it. So, then the next thing he says in verse 37 to 39, he says, "And no one puts new wineskin into old wineskins." So he's just kind of doubling down on the parables here. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, for the new wine would burst the wineskins, spilling the wine and ruining the skins. New wine must be stored in new wineskins, but no one who drinks the old wine seems to want the new wine. The old is just fine, they say. So, to kind of explain this for a second, all right, and then we'll kind of come back to what we're saying, what the meaning of the parable is. Yeah. In that day, wine was not kept in bottles, all right? It was, what they would do is they would take goat skin and they would sew it together to form like a watertight bottle. And so it was, and they would call it a wine skin because they put the wine in there. But what would happen is they would pour new wine into a new wine skin and then they would leave it in there. And as it fermented, it would expand and it would create that air and it would stretch out the wineskin, but it was okay because it was a new wineskin, so it had some give to it. It had room to grow. It had room to expand.
Like that.
All right? But then what would happen is if you took that already stretched out wineskin and if you chugged that down and got done and then poured new wine into the already used wineskin and bottled it up, when that new wine tried to expand, it would just split the old one. Yeah. It couldn't take it. Yeah. It wouldn't contain it. So new wine had to be put into new wineskin or it would burst, it would rupture. Yeah. And so again, Jesus is explaining that I didn't come to patch up the old religious system of Judaism, and while it was good for a season, it was God's plan for a season of time, it couldn't contain the new message of Jesus. The old way of doing things couldn't contain the new message because the old system was, if you sin, you have to make a sacrifice and you have to go and raise the animal and you have to bring the animal to the priest and the priest has to bring it in and inspect it and bless it. And then you have to bring that up to the altar and you got to slit that and it's all got to be done a certain way at a certain time and all these different things. And then you have to go out and if you sin again, then you have to go through that whole thing all over again. And it's like there was all these steps and things. And then Jesus came and he's going to lay down his life for the forgiveness of sin. That's the new covenant,
Yeah.
is that if anyone would believe in Jesus, then they would be saved and forgiven. The atonement or the price of sin would be paid. And that old way of doing things couldn't hold that message, because the old way of doing things was so man-made. It was so rules-driven. It was just filled with man-made rules and regulations and ideas. And Jesus was just something new.
The two were just literally not compatible.
And so it just did not fit. And it literally would have just all blown up. All right? It would have just, the good news of Jesus didn't fit into the rigid legalistic system that was the old law.
Yeah.
And that's what would happen to these goatskins, is they would get hard, they would become hardened as they stretched out, and if you tried to, it would just crack and it would break. And so if you tried to put Jesus into the old way of doing things, it wouldn't stand up to it. Now, you could take the idea, so this is what's interesting though, is you can take the old foundation of the law, which was to be in relationship with God. God called for holiness. He called for us to be holy as he is holy. He called for purification. That is the foundation of our relationship with God. And so that was the old, like that's the old thing. And so it's like you can take that and bring it into Jesus, but you can't take Jesus and put it into that, if that makes sense. And so that was what Jesus was doing here, is he's saying the two don't
mix.
They don't mix.
Yeah. And even as you're talking, it's making me think about like real life things that happened that it just blew up and was not good. If you go into Acts, where it was like Pharisees and people were getting saved and they were believing in Jesus, but they were still trying to implement old laws, old rules, and it did not go well. And it just,
this was the division. This was the division of the early church.
Paul had to come in and correct it.
The division of the early church was constantly, but you're not following the rules. You're not following the old way of doing things. How come this was, part of the division? How come your disciples, the students of Paul, how come your disciples are eating meat, and this one's not? That's why Paul had to call Peter out one day, is because Peter was like gorging on meat one day, and then some guys came in from another city, some of the other believers came in, and they didn't eat meat because they were under the old law. They were still living under those, and so Paul calls him a hypocrite, and it turned bad. But it was because they were all dividing, because some were trying to take Jesus and make it about Jesus and the old way of doing things, and Jesus is saying there's a new way.
Another example is they were, yes, we believe in Jesus, and yes, Jesus, but then no, you have to be, and Jesus saves us, but no, you have to be circumcised in order to be saved. And they were demanding that because that goes back to that old covenant. Yeah.
And so it really is Jesus saying, listen, there was a season of time for all of those things, but there is something new that's happening. And so really when Jesus answers that, they ask the question about fasting. He says, I get it. I understand what you're saying. Right now, I'm here. They don't need to fast because everything that you fast for is available to them right now. That's why they're not fasting. And here's the deal, guys. He said, there's something new that's happening. And so you gotta learn to get out of your old way of thinking and begin to think in a new way. And so you don't take the old, and I think the easiest way to do this is just to kind of bring it into our life today, okay? Is sometimes what can happen is we can fill our own heads with our own rules and ideas of what it means to bring Jesus into our lives. And unfortunately, a lot of times I feel like we try to cram Jesus into our own concepts and into our own thoughts. And honestly, our minds and our understanding of God are so limited, they cannot contain what God wants to do. And so it's like trying to cram Jesus into very limited, small ways of thinking.
So in looking up, I was just looking up what are wineskins? How are they made and all this kind of stuff? How are they used? And one thing that was said that stood out to me is the fact that an old wineskin, it just becomes stretched beyond its limit, like stretched to its limit, I should say. So an old wineskin is stretched to its limit. And I think that's today, like, and how do I apply this to my life too? Just the, I have to let God do something new in me. And I have to have a new place and make new room for that. Because if I don't, the old things have just been stretched to their limit, and we need to make room. That's why I like that word that you used but earlier, of just letting God have room to do that. But we can't do that if we don't have a new way of thinking, if we're not a new container of thinking.
And what stood out to me as I read this so much today, is I started just thinking through the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of the apostles and the disciples in the early church. And again, I feel like so many people today view Jesus, and I'm just going to use kind of the parable metaphors here, the symbolism that Jesus used a little bit. I feel like so many people apply Jesus to their life as a patch, something to just fix a hole in their life. And on the surface, and here's the problem, is sometimes as Christians, that's how we present Jesus to people. Oh, you're sad? Hey, Jesus wants to give you joy.
Meaning you want help in this one area.
Right. And so we're gonna slap Jesus as a patch over this part of your life. So you just keep wearing that same old ratty shirt of just trying to do things your own way, right? And we're going to put a Jesus patch on this hole in your life right here. Well, the problem is as Jesus tries to do something, he just begins to tear away at the old life, and we're like, oh no, this is terrible. And so then our concept of Jesus gets ruined, because it said both garments get ruined, right? And so it's like, oh no, our concept of Jesus has gotten ruined, because I thought Jesus was just a patch, but the patch isn't holding. Why isn't the patch holding? It's because your old life is supposed to die.
Yeah.
And
that's really a good verse too. What is that?
Behold, old things pass away. Behold, old things.
I'm thinking about the old man dying.
Yeah.
The new man. That's the verse I was thinking about.
Yeah. So that's where I was going with it. Is throughout the New Testament, we have to start to recognize how much Jesus talks about new life.
Yeah.
New life.
Yeah.
New life. New life. It's all about new. And I've said this a couple times, and I don't know, some people might get upset with this idea, but it's been a burden in my heart the last little while for years. And I've grown up that when you come into a prayer time, one of the things you pray for, you pray for revival. We want revival in our city, revival in our church, revive. That typically what that means is we want God to bring something back that once was, right? That's really what it means. We want to revive it. And I understand we're saying breathe life back into it again. But more and more, God's just been convicting me to pray for something new. Like I don't want the old. I want something new. Yeah. And that's what I feel like Jesus is saying here. Is he's like the old was good for what it was for, like for when it was useful. That's what it was for. That old wineskin held a purpose. It held the wine that it needed to hold for that season of life. But now there's new wine, and it needs to go into a new vessel. And so we've got to start seeing Jesus as he's not a patch for just one broken spot in our life, and he's not. He's not just there to kind of top off our life, if you will. I was trying to think of a fluid analogy, right? He's not just there to top off our life and in that way, but he's there to give something new. And so we need to be a new vessel.
And when I think of the wineskin one, I really think about what is a wineskin. It holds something. It's a container. And so it makes me think about just like, I don't want to take it out of context, but it did make me think of like us being that wineskin.
Yeah.
And I want Jesus put into me. And if I don't change my mind and mindset and my attitudes, and if I'm just living in the past and I'm not receiving this new, like You know what I mean? If I'm a container, I hold Jesus. And so it's kind of like that personal.
Well, I think it's even interesting, and I feel like it's the Gospel of Luke says this a little differently than Matthew and Mark, but even that last verse where it says, "But no one who drinks the old wine seems to want the new wine. The old is just fine," they say. And how often do we listen, guys? We talk about this all the time in church. Jesus wants to give you new life. He wants to give you new life. But sometimes I feel like we can say, you know what? I don't know that I want the new life. My old life was just fine. I just want Jesus to be a patch. And so we treat Jesus like a patch on the old life. But he says, I want to give you something new. And I feel like there's too many of us that fall into that last category there, where it's like, you know, we've drank the old wine. We've done things a certain way. The way that we conceptualize God, that's what we're comfortable with. And we don't want anything new. We just want God to fit in. We want Jesus to fit into that.
You just get this picture of you're stuck. You're stuck. And I think, you know, that's something that we can look in our own lives and say, you know, do you ever get to that place in your relationship with God where you get stuck and you're like, okay, you know, today is this day and I do this, and today is this day and I do this, and I have my rituals, or I have my pattern. And it's this thing of you get stuck in that. And again, it goes back to what you're saying. God has new things for us in that line of thinking. I was just thinking about all the times that were mentioned where God does talk about, like, he has new things. So if you go to Isaiah 43, there's a portion where it's talking about the promise and the deliverance from Babylon. It starts at 14, but he talks about like the freedom that they have from Egypt and all that. But then God says, but forget all that. Basically, don't focus on that. It's nothing compared to what I'm going to do, for I'm about to do something new. See, I've already begun. You do not see it. I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. But it just stands out to me as this thing of like, when they exited Egypt, like, that's amazing what God did. In all, we know the miracles, we know the parting of the Red Sea, and that's all amazing. But here, like, God's saying, forget about all that. I've got something new for you. And I think, you know, that sometimes in our Christian life, what we can do too is we can think about, you mentioned it the other day in a small group we were in, of thinking about the good old days. You know, you get stuck in the good old days, and there's nothing wrong because you have these memories of, yes, God, you did this in my life, but you can't get so stuck in the good old days. God has something better for you right now. The day is called today. Like, he's got something for you today. And I just thought, you know, if they're learning that lesson in Isaiah, and then they're learning this lesson here when Jesus, you know, is with them, he's like, I got something new for you. Like, we're still learning that lesson now. And we have the blessing of the Holy Spirit. And he's new in us every day, and he creates like new things for us. And so I think that's amazing too, is you think about, remember when the disciples are upset because Jesus is leaving, and they're like, no, you know, and then he's like, no, I've got something better for you.
Give you something new.
Yeah. So sometimes when something looks new, we freak out. And yet when God's trying to give us something and do something in our lives, we have to give him room and space. And
I think I'd leave you with this, is I challenge you to, as you read through the New Testament, especially through the New Testament, absolutely through the New Testament, to take special notice of the number of times that we're told that God has something new for us. It's a new life. He wants to give us new life. And I'm trying to think of the verse in Hebrews where it talks about not looking back, but looking forward. Looking ahead, looking towards the things that are to come. Like, it's always about moving forward. It's always moving forward. It's not staying in the past. It's not looking back. It's always looking forward to the new things.
And sometimes that's challenging
Yeah.
because it's easy to look back. It's easy to remember when. And,
it's easy to live in comfort. Like,
Yeah.
that's the thing is I think the old is comfortable.
Yeah.
Right? It's what we know. It's what we're used to. But he says, I have something new for you. I just finished with 2 Corinthians 5. Paul says this. He says, so we've stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. At one time, we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view. How differently we know him now. And again, so what he's talking about is there was a time where we just saw Jesus from an earthly point of view, but now that he has died and risen from the dead, reappeared to so many of us, how differently we see him, how much better we understand him. Now that we've received him and understand him to be the Son of God, the Messiah, the Savior of the world, how much of a different concept we have. And he says in verse 17, this means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun.
Yeah.
And so I would just say this, guys, is do not make Jesus simply a patch on a broken spot in your life, on a torn fragment of your life. He is not a patch. He is a new garment. He wants to clothe us with garments of righteousness, right? He wants to clothe us in something brand new. Don't pour Jesus into your old life and expect your old life to get better. Your old life can't handle what Jesus wants to do. He wants to give you new life. Yeah. All right? So we're not pouring Jesus into our old life. We're not pouring Jesus into the old way of doing things. It's not Jesus and everything that I'm comfortable with. It's Jesus and nothing else. It's a new wine. And where there is new wine, there's new power. All right.
You got to listen to that song now.
All right. That's all I have. Did you have more?
No, that's good.
You good? All right. Wants to do a new thing, guys. And I think that's if we get anything out of this, that's what we have to get out of it. Yeah. That's what Jesus was starting to challenge them with this parable. Yeah. Is, hey guys, there's a time and a season for the old. For the fasting, it's something that you need to do. Fasting's still something that we're called to do today. Jesus said there's going to be a time where you continue to do this, but then he said, hey guys, to really understand all of this, you got to get out of your old way of thinking, and you got to start thinking new, because there's new things that I want to do. There's a new way, new things, new covenant, new love. All right. That's it. That's all I got. Yeah. You good?
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being with us today. As always, if you have questions, comments, anything like that, please let us know all about it. Thank you so much for listening. Do us a favor and share the podcast with somebody else. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover, please let us know. We'd always love to cover any and every topic. Maybe every topic.
Would.
Yeah, we'll do it. I promise you we'll do it, all right? So just let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about, and we'll do that. Until next time, thank you for joining us for Lunch with PB&J.
Bye, guys.